Hello and welcome to the lecture on the origins of behavioral neuroscience. This should be a relatively short lecture, just a bit longer bit in the middle about evolution. So in this lecture, we're going to look at the biological roots of behavioral neuroscience. Then I've got some slides I threw in on evolution because I think evolution should be taught in every psychology class. If you've taken Diener's class, you've probably seen some of these slides. And then there will be careers in behavioral neuroscience. So we'll look at those very briefly. So let's start with the roots of behavioral neuroscience. So when we're talking about the roots of behavioral neuroscience, we're talking about the beginnings. We'll start with a major question in neuroscience, in behavioral neuroscience, and that is the mind-body question. And that is, what role does the mind and brain play in the control of behavior? So the mind, at least if we look at the mind itself, if we look at the mind as something maybe spiritual or outside of the body, you get what's called dualism. Dualism looks at the mind and body as separate, that the mind maybe controls the body, but it is separate or excluded from the body. And I use the word spiritual here because this is more of the thought that of maybe if you're looking at it within one religious context, a soul or the spirit, the type of thing that is not in the body but represents who we are or what we are. So dualism looks at the mind and the body as separate, whereas monism looks at everything consists of matter and energy. The mind is produced by the workings of the nervous system. So the mind is part of the body. The mind and the body are one. So the mind is within the body, that type of thing. And this is the approach taken by behavioral neurosciences. So let's look at some of the history of behavioral neuroscience. I'm going to go through this real quick, and I'll say this right now from the start. None of the tests, none of the questions on the exam will require you to memorize a name or a date. I may say something like from this slide, Galen dissected and studied animals to find out that nerves were what? Something like connected to the brain. So you don't have to remember Galen specifically, you have to remember his concept. Or Galen dissected and studied animals that found that nerves were connected to the brain. What did this allow us to do? That type of thing. Those would be types of questions I would ask. I would never ask who dissected and studied animals and in what year did he do it. No, that's absurd. I can't remember names. I don't expect you to remember names. So starting with this, going into it then, so back in the past, in history, in ancient times, there were many different cultures that basically looked at the different parts of the body that were believed to be the center of thoughts, of emotions, of the brain, not the brain itself, but of the consciousness, let's say. And many thought it was the heart, but obviously we know that's not right. It was Socrates who believed that it was actually in the head and the brain, even though many disagreed with him. And it wasn't until about 130 to 200 CE, Common Era, that we had the fact that Galen dissected and studied animals and found out that all the nerves in the body were connected to the brain, going back and basically confirming what some of the philosophers of the time thought, but kind of going against others. Then, way later in the 17th century, Descartes believed that humans and animals were mechanical devices, but the behaviors were controlled by environmental stimuli, and some of the movements were automatic and involuntary, which he called reflexes. So he was really on the right track here, even though he followed dualism. He believed that the mind was separate from the body, but he believed that there was parts of the body that was actually activating stimuli. This led into, in the 19th century, Mueller, he looked at nerve energies and how all nerves carried the same basic message, but we perceived it in different ways. So basically, he did dissections and determined that the nerves of the body were sending impulses that resulted in different messages being transferred. We know now that the reason different messages are transferred, even if the basic message is the same, which is electrical impulses, we'll get to that later, is that the different channels were important and the different receiving systems were important. But he found out that through this that the brain is functionally divided. Then Florenz, and I do butcher some names, I apologize for that. I'm not the greatest with names, as I said before. Florenz experimented on the brain. He started a process that we now know, that we now utilize, or behavioral neuroscientists utilize a lot, and that is ablation. Ablation is, at least the early part of it, is where a specific part of the brain was removed, and the whatever behaviors that affected was then attributed to that part of the brain. It isn't perfect, but at least early on, it was starting. The scientists started to see what different parts of the brain were responsible for what different functions. We now have much more humane ways of ablation. You can do certain things where you can basically, by putting electrodes on the surface of the skull, you can turn off certain parts of the brain, and through that can more easily tell what is going on with those different parts of the brain. Broca took this and used it and actually studied stroke victims. He didn't do ablation necessarily himself. He did some, but not straight. What his was more of is he checked did autopsies on stroke victims and was able to identify specific areas of the brain that were responsible for specific things by looking at, okay, this person had a stroke, what was their deficits after the stroke? They survived the stroke, what was their deficits? And then if they died later, dissected their brain and found out which parts of the brain the stroke had affected and then could attribute it. One of the things he's known for the most, and we'll talk about this later, is Broca's area, which is a area of the brain that is responsible in part for production of speech. So people who had a stroke and then had difficulty with speech, he found that when he did autopsies on their brains, he found that was in the area, the Broca's area that was named after him, was where the stroke had occurred. Cajal discovered that the nervous system actually consisted of billions of discrete individual neurons. So he actually won the Nobel Prize for this, figuring out that our brains aren't just like a few neurons, we're talking billions of neurons. And that kind of led us to where we are today. So where we are today, contemporary research, many different inventions, advances, discoveries, technologies, all of this comes from behavioral neuroscience. Behavioral neuroscience is a very important field because it allows us to make many advances about the brain. And the more we know about the brain, the more we will be able to understand behavior. I'll talk about this coming up in the evolution stuff, but the more we know about the brain and the more we know about the why, and this is where evolution comes in, the why of the behaviors, the more we can understand and control the behaviors. One emerging, and it's not emerging anymore, but it's come to prominence. One part or component of behavioral neuroscience is epigenetics, and epigenetics looks at how the environment affects genetic expression. So we know we've got a lot of genes that just don't do anything, or we were believed to be not doing anything. It turns out that environmental factors can change the way these genes are expressed to result in genetic expression that wasn't previously present. And in general, behavioral neuroscience is an ongoing interdisciplinary research field. It's ongoing. There is a lot going on. It is probably at the forefront of psychology. It is one of the biggest or the best paid, so to say, fields of psychology is neuroscience. And it's one of those that it's ongoing, it's interdisciplinary, you get it from a lot of different fields, and the research is very exciting. So let's get right into it. So first, what we have to do is define evolution. So at this point, I would ask you to tell me what you think evolution is. And I'm not talking about evolution in living things, I'm just talking about evolution in general. I'm not talking about Darwinian evolution, evolution by natural selection, I'm just talking about evolution in general. So when we talk about evolution and we define it, evolution is just simply defined as change over time. Now, when we're talking about it in terms of living things, we're talking about change over time in living things. But when we're talking about evolution, we can incorporate it into things like evolution of machinery, how machinery has changed over time, that type of thing. But specific to this class, we're looking at living things, so we're going to look at what evolution means in the context of living things. So in the context of living things, evolution refers to change over time of the structures of living things. And it's important to note that many scientists, even before Darwin, especially a lot of things like geologists, embryologists, archaeologists that existed at the time, they suspected that evolution did occur. It's been known all the way back to Plato, and back even farther than that. For thousands of years, we've got writings that talk about how basically living things changed over time. Some of the earlier works talked about how speciation might occur, how one might become another, and others just referred to more within a species, how that changed over time. And you do have to look at the history of humans as something where it's been known for a long time that evolution occurred, because at least those minor changes within a species, because before modern times, up for the last about 12,000 years, humans were farmers. And farmers understand it because they know that if they breed certain livestock together, or they use certain types of, let's say, grains, that they can select for traits that they like, and that can be basically something that can happen over time. So they had this idea of that evolution did occur. However, the why or the how it worked wasn't known. And there were many theories. The most popular one prior to Darwin was Lamarckian, so you might hear it called Lamarckian evolution. Lamarck, he talked about inheritance of acquired characteristics. What's important here is this word acquired, because Lamarckian evolution basically said that characteristics you acquired in your lifetime could then be passed on to offspring. And it did fit some things we knew, or that was known at the time, about evolution occurring, that offspring tended to have some of these traits of their parents. However, there was a big flaw in it, because we know now that acquired characteristics aren't passed on, but if that was the case, then somebody who got a scar or lost a limb, then that would be passed on. So there was a lot of question even at the time about how this could even be possible, since we knew that a lot of acquired things weren't passed on. So the traditional thing you see with this is where the giraffe got his long neck by reaching down to take a drink, and an alligator grabbed his head and pulled it stretched, and that's how a giraffe got, and then that was passed down, and that's how giraffes got long necks. So there was all these theories, and along came Darwin. And Darwin is a very interesting individual. At the end of this slide, I'll post a video that you can go watch. It's a 2-hour long video. However, the first 15 minutes is the most important 15 minutes, but I actually recommend you watch this 2-hour video. It was a Nova special on PBS. It's really fantastic into what happened with Darwin and how he came up with evolution and all that. We're going to talk about the basics of it here, but there's way too much to talk about in just a few minutes here. So Darwin came along. He was a third generation surgeon. So his dad was a surgeon, his grandpa was a surgeon. He was planning on becoming a surgeon. It didn't work out for him because the first time he saw blood in the operating theater, he fled it and decided to never go back. You gotta remember, at these times, we're talking about no anesthesia, no pain anesthetics. You're cutting people open while they can feel everything. And just some people couldn't deal with it, and I know I wouldn't be able to deal with it. So he decided to go into seminary. So he went to seminary school, and part of that, at least at the time, people who went into seminary had to specialize in something. So he specialized in geology, and he basically got a good grounded education in the sciences. He came from a well-to-do family, so he had time for leisure. And while his grandpa and father were surgeons, they were also horse farmers. They had a horse farm. They bred horses. And that's going to kind of lead back into some of the things that the way Darwin was raised and the way he ended up what he did. So Darwin goes on this journey. At the time, there were explorers that were basically exploring or charting the world. And there was a ship called the Beagle that was going to basically map the coast of South America. And at the time, captains were kind of a different class than the sailors. And captains weren't allowed to commingle with the sailors. They were the boss. They weren't allowed to really talk to, eat dinner with, stuff like that. Well, a voyage to go map the coast of South America is going to take a long time. We're talking many months to years, depending on how long it took them. So what would often happen is captains would hire on a scientist from a well-to-do family who would basically be there to do science things while they're on the trip, but also to be a companion to the captain, someone the captain can talk to, have dinner with, that type of thing. So for this one, Darwin got employed. Darwin got hired to go on the Beagle with the captain to basically be his dinner companion. And he learned a lot of things on this. And it really started him thinking about things like evolutionary change. So he came along, he liked Lamarck's theory, but he thought it was incomplete in scope, so he wanted to explain a few things. First, he wanted to explain the mechanism of evolutionary change. What is actually going on that's causing this, or the thing that is occurring for evolutionary change. The next is the existence of purposeful structures. Why do eyes exist? Why do organs exist? Why are there different things like a beak on a bird? Why did these exist when you're talking about in the context of evolution? And then finally, he was interested in the origin of species. I should very much point out here, origin of species does not mean origin of life. Evolution is not concerned with the origin of life. The origin of life is something entirely different. The origin of species, however, is. How do species come about? Popular theory at the time was religious in that it was all species were created at the beginning of creation, and that's the way it was. However, based on travels, and it was known long before this, that species go extinct. So if species go extinct, the argument would then be, well, new species would likely come about. Otherwise, at the beginning of time, at the beginning of creation, there would be so many different species that the world would be overcrowded. So this indications that there's this change, that speciation occurs. So Darwin was interested in the origin of species. This is that video. Check the slides without the lecture to get to it. Okay, so what are the things that Darwin got on his journey, and as well as in his life, that gave him clues to the actual mechanism for evolution? Well, the first is Darwin's famous finches. So one of the places that the beagle stopped was the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are really interesting in that they are pretty isolated from each other, and they're isolated from the mainland. So on these islands, you've got each island had their own species. So Darwin collected birds from each of these islands, and he thought he had a whole bunch of different types of birds. And when he got back, he actually went to someone who specialized in birds, and that person said, no, those were all just variations of finches. They were all different species of finches, even though they looked very different. Some had huge beaks, some had small beaks, some had long beaks, some had short beaks. They had different colors, all of this. So this was one of the indicators that he had that speciation occurred when you get this isolation like the different islands did. And he actually went a step further and found out that on islands that were dry, that only had like nuts and things like that, the finches there tended to have smaller, or well, not smaller, but shorter, stronger beaks, because they needed to use those beaks to break open the nuts. However, the islands that had lots of flowers, the finches there had longer pointed beaks because they could get the nectar and stuff from the flowers. So each finch was actually well adapted to the island it was on. Another thing Darwin had going for him, and I already mentioned this kind of briefly, is horse breeding. So what went on here is that he learned from his family in years of horse breeding that some characteristics from the parents are passed on to the offspring, like Lamarck said, but it wasn't the acquired characteristics, it was the characteristics they were born with. So some color markings, size, different things like that of the parents are passed on. So he had this idea of passed on traits. And then he read a paper by Mathis that said that more organisms are produced than can survive and reproduce themselves. This leads to this struggle for existence. This is actually the origins of what is believed to be the survival of the fittest, even though Darwin didn't say, when he said survival of the fittest, he didn't mean it in the way we talk about it now, but this is the origins of that. And Darwin even did some calculations, and one elephant who began reproducing at the age of 30 had one calf every 10 years and had 6 calves total. That doesn't seem like a lot. After 500 years, that one elephant would have 15 million descendants. So after just 500 years, we'd have 15 million elephants that are just a descendant of that one female elephant. So it stands to reason that if all offspring produced survived and reproduced themselves, then the world would be overrun with all the different species. We know now, we look at it, that yes, a lot of young die of various different reasons. Even adults, especially prey animals, die of predation. Even predators die of things like starvation, not being able to get kills, things like that. So there's, in all species, there's this struggle for existence. So through this, and with a little bit, I'm not going to say help of Wallace. Wallace is another researcher. The interesting thing is he's not remembered, even though when Darwin presented his work, Wallace co-presented, because his work was basically, he found it independent of Darwin, all of this. You don't hear about Wallace, though, because some of the things we're going to talk about later, Wallace disagreed with, and it turns out Darwin was right and Wallace was wrong about these other things. So it's more of the fact that Darwin was older, more prestigious, so he got a little bit more recognition from the beginning, but then even as time went on, Darwin kept publishing books that was based on this theory that he kept getting more and more things right, whereas Wallace got some things wrong. So, what is this evolution by natural selection that Darwin came up with? There's 3 components to it. There will be an exam question on this. The first is that variability exists, that there is variance. We already talked about this, but this is the basically that different members of a species have different traits. Some people, let's talk about in humans, some people are taller than others, some people are shorter, some people have different colored hair, some people have different colored eyes. There's different levels of all these different traits. And there's a ton of different traits that we have variability on. So variance exists. Variability is passed on. This is the second one, and this is heredity. So some of the variability we have, not the acquired variability, even though we'll come back to epigenetics later and talk about how there might have even been, Lamarck might have even been onto a little something there, but that's besides the point here. The point here is variability is passed on. This is heredity. So your traits, your hair color, your eye color, it can be passed on. And some variants survive and reproduce better than others. And both of these are important, survival and reproduction. I'll talk about this later, but when we look at survival and reproduction, evolution doesn't occur if reproduction doesn't occur. Because going back to this, the heredity doesn't occur if reproduction doesn't occur. But now this third thing, selection, that is that some variants survive and reproduce better than others, that means that some individuals, based on their traits, are able to survive better and are able to reproduce better. Let's talk about a wolf. A wolf that has more stamina is more likely to survive. It's more likely to be able to chase down prey. A giraffe that has a longer neck is more likely to an extent, there's always trade-offs, but a giraffe that has a longer neck is able to eat more because they can get higher up in the trees eating, so they are able to survive better. That's the survival side. Then there's the reproduction side, traits that aid in reproduction. We'll talk later in the semester about things like sperm competition, where you've got ejaculate size and how that matters, and how that aids in reproduction. So some variants lead to better survival and better reproduction chances. Therefore, those traits should be selected for, because if the individual is surviving better and is reproducing more, then it will pass on those traits more. So when all three conditions are met, some variants will increase in the population, those traits that aid in survival and reproduction, and some will decrease, those traits that hinder survival and reproduction, in frequency. And this slow change in frequency in these traits over time is referred to as evolution by natural selection. Sometimes you hear it as evolution by selection, but you just hear it as natural selection now. ENS, or evolution by natural selection. So the slow change, and sometimes there's fast change, but it's generally a very slow change in frequencies over time, is evolution by natural selection. And this is the basics of evolution as it pertains to biology. I'm not going to go into the actual mechanics of it more than this. I'm not going to go into things like genetic drift and all that kind of stuff. I just want to, I'll talk about a few things, but I just want to get out that this is the basics of evolution. So when we talk about things later this semester, this is what I'm referring back to. And I'm going to come back up to the survival and reproduction thing too. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit more next week. But of the two of these, what is more important? And I've kind of already hinted at it. Most people think it's survival. Most people think it's survive. Because we always talk about survival of the fittest and all of those things. But that is actually not the case. What is more important is reproduction. I already said it, but evolution cannot occur without reproduction. If an organism survives for 1 million years but never reproduces, then evolution does not occur because they are not passing on their genes, they're not having offspring, evolution is not occurring. An organism can survive for 1 hour and reproduce, and evolution's occurring. That is because it reproduced, it passed on traits. Survival is important because the longer an organism survives, the more opportunity it's going to have to reproduce. but of the two, reproduction is more important. Okay, let's talk about some misconceptions. So some common misunderstandings and misconceptions. So we're going to talk about human first. The first misconception is that human behavior is genetically determined. So the concept here is that if evolution is true, then our behavior is genetically determined. It's all based on our genes, that our environment is unimportant. Well, this is something we're going to talk about later, but it's just plain old not true. The evolutionary theory presents an interactionist framework. That is that evolved genetically based adaptations are based on or triggered by the environment. So you have these genetic predispositions that environment affects. So you see the two pictures here. The top one, you've got calluses. So calluses are an adaptation. However, your calluses won't appear unless you have an environmental framework, an environment where the calluses are forced to appear. So if you work with your hands a lot, you'll form calluses on your hands. The next is the sunscreen. And we'll talk about skin tone a little bit in a few minutes, but sunscreen, not sunscreen, suntans. I'm not talking about sunscreen, sorry. Suntans. Sunscreens beyond this. Suntans are something where it's an adaptation. Those who, especially with lighter skins, that are out in the sun will get tanned, which makes the skin more resistant to the sun. And this is a genetics cause that, but you're not going to get that expressed without the environment. And we'll talk about skin tone more in a minute. The next is, if it's evolutionary, we can't change it. And this is also a myth because since genes and environment interact, if we don't like the evolutionary outcomes, we can alter the environment to alter the outcome. So this goes back to the calluses. With the calluses, when you're looking at the calluses there, if we don't want calluses, we just don't use our hands. But even if you get calluses, you can use things like lotions that'll reduce them. You can do other things. So you can change the environment and you change the outcome. And that's one of the reasons why, and I'll say it here, the better we understand our involved psychological mechanisms and how they interact with the environment, the greater our power to create desirable outcomes. It's why I always teach evolution in all of my classes. This is one of those classes you can't get around teaching it, but I teach evolution in all of my classes because of this huge point right here. The better we understand the mechanism, the better we understand the why and the what causes it, the better we can change the outcome if we want a better outcome or a different outcome. So it's really important to study evolution to get to that point where you can figure out the why and the what and potentially change it for the better. Humans have a lot of deleterious traits. Humans have a lot of traits that are very bad. And a lot of it is due to an environmental mismatch. So this is another component of evolution, is evolution occurred in the past. Evolution is occurring today, but who we are is due to the evolutionary pressures of the past. It's not due to the pressures of the present, it's due to the pressures of the past. So the evolutionary pressures of the past shaped who we are today. I'll actually talk about that a little bit on the next slide. That is that current mechanisms are optimally designed. This is actually a myth. Our current mechanisms are not necessarily optimally designed because our current mechanisms represent adaptations to the past. It's adaptations to past environments. The current environment, if it differs substantially from our previous ones, it means the mechanisms may not, that it were great, that were all outstanding, that were very adaptive, that were very beneficial in previous environments, that they are no longer beneficial. They can actually be deleterious. They can harm us because of this environmental change. So it's what's called an environmental mismatch. So For this, one of the key ones I talk about is candy, sugars. So with sugar, when our desire to eat sugar evolved, the environment was such that sugars were hard to come by. You might be able to get fruits and things like that to get sugars, but they would be rare. They would be hard to get. And they are very high in calories. So if you're in the past and the sugars are rare, but they're high in calories, and you're always on the edge of potential starvation, and you come across sugars, you should have a strong desire to eat all the sugars, to take in all of those calories. It would be very beneficial. So in our past environment, we would have evolved traits that would have gave us great desire to eat sugars. However, now we're in an entirely different environment. We're in an environment where you can go to any corner store and get sugar. You can get aisles and aisles of sugar. You can get so much sugar that you basically become obese on the sugar. So this is a perfect example of how our current mechanisms are not optimally designed. This over-desire for sugar was great in the past. It is not so great now. Here's another example of mechanisms that are not optimally designed. That's skin tone, skin color. So I talked about how I was going to come back to this, but if all adaptations were, or all mechanisms were optimally designed, our skin tone would be perfect for our environment. However, it's not. Why is it not? Because one of the big things is that all adaptations that we have out there have costs. Some of the costs are so minimal that they're negligible. Some of the costs are great. Skin tone is a perfect example here because the lighter skin we have, there's benefits, but there's deficits. The darker skin we have, there's benefits, but there's also deficits. So for example, dark skin is very protective against the sun. Dark skin, you don't burn if you go out in the sun. People with darker skin have, even though they do have chances of getting skin cancer, their chances of getting skin cancer is much lower than those with lighter colored skin. That's because those with lighter colored skin can easily be damaged by the sun. So you might ask the question, why don't we all have darker colored skin then? It would be, if it's a benefit to have darker colored skin, you have less chance of cancer, less chance of dying from it, less chance of getting sun poisoning from an overly powerful sunburn, stuff like that. We don't all have darker skin because of this right here. Because all adaptations have cost. The cost of darker skin is a less ability for the skin to absorb vitamin D from the sun. So we get a lot of our vitamin D from the sun. It's our primary source of getting vitamin D. And the darker your skin, the harder your skin has of absorbing vitamin D. In environments where it is very, very sunny, where it is just all kinds of sun, all kinds of heat, all of that, in those types of environments, even having darker skin, you're going to absorb enough vitamin D. However, in environments where part of the year there's no sun at all, like the Scandinavian countries, Northern Europe, that type of thing, where you have months out of the year where there might only be a few hours of sun. And not only that, you got to bundle up in a lot of clothes because it's so cold. So in those places, you're not going to be absorbing vitamin D as easily. So having a lighter colored skin is an advantage because the sun that you do get, it's easier to absorb vitamin D from. So this is where you get that trade-off. There's advantages to darker colored skin, that is, that it's more protective against the sun. But there's also disadvantages, that is, that there's a lower chance of absorbing vitamin D. There's advantages to lighter colored skin, that is, you absorb vitamin D better. But there's also disadvantages, that is, that you don't have that protective layer against the sun. So when we look at this, we see this trade-off you have. So that's why different people in different environments, historically in our past when these traits evolved, had different color skins. Now, we are in a much different environment now. So this goes back to the current mechanisms aren't optimally designed. That is, that people are inside more. That means those with darker colored skins aren't getting enough vitamin D. People move. So people from areas where there's a lot more sun move to areas where there's less sun. People from areas where there's less sun move to areas where there's more sun. So you get these environmental mismatches showing that these current mechanisms aren't optimally designed. Another example of current mechanisms being not optimally designed is, and this is very important, natural selection does not have foresight. Natural selection cannot see the future. Natural selection only works on the best solution that was available at the time. It usually finds solutions or traits that are just better than other ones currently in the population, not necessarily the best one. So you'll get traits that are good but not great simply because the trait that is great never appeared. So the one that's good, which was better than the one that was okay, which is better than the one that was bad, the one that's good is more likely to be passed on. Like, and a perfect example of that is the human eye, or actually all vertebrate eyes. So one thing interesting about the eyes is we know of 8 distinct evolutions of the eyes in living things. Vertebrates is one of those evolutions, but when you look at things like octopi, they have a different evolution. When you look at various different insects, they have different evolutions of eyes. So there's at least 8 different evolutions of eyes that we know. But in vertebrates, one of the big problems with the vertebrate eye is there's a blind spot. This optic nerve, where it comes in the back, causes a blind spot in our vision. Now, this isn't as big of a deal, but it is still, when you consider it for prey animals to have a spot in their vision that something could potentially sneak up on them on, and to that split second that it's in their blind spot could cost them their life. So because of this, it's definitely not optimally designed. Optimally designed would be to have no blind spot, such as like with mollusks, the squids and octopi, their retina is in front of the optic nerve, thus they have no blind spot. So and even theirs isn't necessarily optimally designed, but it's better than the human eye and the vertebrate eye. However, the vertebrate eye is the way it is because that was what was best at the time. The other example is by far my favorite example. This is the one that it just shows that mechanisms, there's some that evolution did occur, and that it did occur because we can show how poorly designed something like the recurrent laryngeal nerve is. So the recurrent laryngeal nerve starts at the back of the brain here and goes to the front of the brain here. However, the recurrent version of it, so the superior goes straight through. This is the superior here that you see. The superior goes straight. It's a very short thing, a few inches, sometimes up to 4 or 5 inches. In some mammals, it would be less than an inch. However, the recurrent laryngeal nerve goes all the way down under the aortic arch and back up to the throat, to the larynx. And why is it doing that? That is because when this nerve first evolved, it evolved in fish. Ancestor all the way back to fish, and in those fish, or at least the ancestors of modern fish, ancestors of all mammals as well, but back before there was mammals, back to fish, it went straight because the fish's head is shaped in such a way. You've got the fish head. I'm not a great artist, but you got the fish head. The brain would have been here, the recurrent laryngeal nerve here, the aortic arch would have been here, and it would have gone straight through. So it would have still gone around the aortic arch, but it would have gone around it pretty much a straight shot. And what ended up happening is that as mammals evolved, the heart sunk into the chest cavity away from the head, And this is where the laryngeal nerve that was wrapped around the aortic arch that comes off the heart, it pulled down into the chest cavity. So you get this nerve that's really long. And this nerve, if it gets cut, neck injury, it can cause serious damage, if not death. So it's something that is very important. So it descends, I already said all this. One of the great examples of this is it would be like driving from Detroit to Ann Arbor, but going to Toledo. So instead of going straight from Detroit to Ann Arbor, you go down 75 and come back up 23. It's definitely not the optimal way to do it. And the prototypical, the one that's the biggest example, modern example we have of this is the giraffe. It was even worse in some dinosaurs that had super long necks, but the giraffe is a modern animal we have where we can see the recurrent laryngeal nerve that goes all the way from the back of the brain here, all the way down into the chest cavity, below the aortic arch, all the way back to here, where it's something that could be a few inches long, and instead it is a dozen feet or more long. And this is, again, the perfect example of showing evolution in practice where the evolution occurred because it was the best option present, not necessarily the optimal option. So now that we've talked about some of the misconceptions about evolution, let's look at some of the other components of evolution. So one of the other components of evolution is something that actually caused Darwin no end of stress. So when Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he talked about evolution, he talked about all the different things, and he actually said in it, if someone can show instances that disproved it, he welcomed them because he wanted to make sure that he was right. But one of the things that actually gave him, he even said it straight up in one of his correspondence that kept him up at night was the peacock's tail. Because the peacock's tail, as far as it comes to evolution, doesn't seem to have an evolutionary advantage. Actually, it's a pretty big evolutionary disadvantage. That is, it's easy for predators to grab. It's easy for parasites to get into. So there's no actual physical advantage to it. It doesn't help it survive. It doesn't help it find food. So what is its advantage? And he through long thought came up with sexual selection. And this is actually one of the things him and Wallace differed on. Wallace didn't believe in sexual selection. Darwin did. Sexual selection actually turns out to be not only correct, but it's actually a very powerful component of natural selection. But sexual selection was defined by Darwin as the advantage of which certain individuals have over others of the same sex and species in exclusive relation to reproduction. So this goes back to that thing I was talking about where I said that both survival and reproduction are important, but which one is more important? It is reproduction. Reproduction is more important. So what ends up happening is that traits that aid in reproduction, not necessarily traits, they might even hinder survival, but traits that aid in reproduction will be selected for over traits that don't aid in reproduction but aid in survival. So a peacock's tail is the perfect example. It is that indication, that sign to a female peahen that the peacock is strong enough. He is physically strong enough that even though he has this giant tail, he is physically strong enough to stay away from predators. And also, he has a good enough immune system to resist parasites because his tail is so colorful. Peacocks with parasites, their tail isn't as colorful. The feathers fall out, things like that. So this peacock, he's got a really strong immune system, and he's strong enough and smart enough to stay away from predators. He's telling the female that. The female sees that and goes, oh, my offspring then will be strong enough and fast enough and have a good enough immune system. So she chooses him as a mate. So that this tail, even though it potentially hinders survival, it aids in reproduction. So with sexual selection, the same three conditions must be met. You must have variance, you must have traits that are passed on, and there must be selection. The difference is that in sexual selection, the variants or traits that increase reproductive success are selected for in favor of traits that promote survival. Now, you can't have a trait that promotes reproduction so much that it costs the thing its life, because again, it still has to survive to reproduce, but things that might actually hinder its survivability but really increase its reproduction will likely be selected for. So finishing up on the evolution of the human brain, so we know a few things about the brain, and we know a few things about the evolution specifically about the human brain. First, the human brain continues to grow after birth. So in humans, they have what's called a slow life history. Fast life history versus slow life history, I haven't gone into that, but it basically refers to how much development occurs in the womb and how fast development occurs. Species with fast life history usually are prey. They're animals that are preyed on, and they develop very fast. They don't have time to dedicate resources to having a big brain because they have to develop so fast to be able to get away from predators. Whereas species that are more predators or don't have necessarily predators, they can develop much slower. And because they can develop much slower, they don't have to get away from predators as much. They can dedicate more resources to cognitive development, to cognitive and brain growth after birth. And you see this like in elephants, but you also see it definitely in humans that most of the brain growth occurs after birth. Yes, all of the neurons are essentially present, and we'll talk about this later, but almost all of the neurons are present at birth, but the brain still continues to grow and develop after birth. And this occurs, the brain circuits, the neural circuits, are develop based on the environment and experience. Then you've got neoteny. This is the prolongation of maturation that I was talking about because of humans having a slow life history, not being vulnerable to predators, at least not as much as many other species. It allows for the brain development to be a slow, long process. Why? What's the benefit of a slow, long process? That means that it gives more chance for the environment to affect the development of the brain, which gives a better adaptation to the environment, which is why humans basically have the ability to have higher cognitive processing, because we have such a slow development of the human brain. And the human brain reaches its adult size in late adolescence, but one of the things you learn from developmental psychology is the human brain does not stop developing until you're in your 20s. There is parts of the brain that do not continue until, or do not stop, or parts of the brain development that don't stop until you're in your 20s. So a couple things along with this, you get plasticity. This is the ability for the brain to change over time. It allows for you to modify learning based on the environment, but it also allows for the brain, if it's damaged, to make up for damaged areas. And you get neurogenesis as well, and this is the generation of new neurons, and this is something that's a lifelong process. Yes, a lot of it happens early on, but it is a lifelong process. So the last thing we're going to talk about just very briefly here is some careers in neuroscience. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. You can Google this and get way more information. Your book has some information, but Google's even better. So the three main fields you're going to find for careers in neuroscience are behavioral neuroscientists. These are people with a PhD who study behavioral phenomena with experiments on lab animals. If you're interested more in the ethics of research on lab animals. The book has some stuff on that. I'm not going to go into it. Just note that there is very big, very strict regulations on research on animals to make sure that the animals aren't harmed unduly. What behavioral neuroscience do is try to understand the physiology of behavior. They study the sensory processes, sleep, emotional behavior, ingestion behavior, aggression behavior, sexual behavior, parental behavior, all of these different behaviors, things like learning and memory. They study all of these and try and figure them out by using animal models to map it onto humans. Those in neurology come from neuroscience, and these are the people who tend to diagnose and treat the nervous system diseases. So they will study the behavior of people whose brains have been damaged by natural causes, or doing those ablation studies I was talking about before. But in humans, we don't do ablation such that we cut out parts of the brain. People have in the past. Definitely not ethical, but there's studies now where you can shut off small parts of the brain and see what kind of changes to behavior it causes. And then the final one is cognitive neuroscientists. These are researchers with a PhD, usually in psychology, who specialize in training in the principles and procedures of neurology. So these three, they're highly interrelated, but they are three fields that people tend to go into. You can do some of these fields with just a bachelor's or a master's, but these are fields that typically you're going to get a PhD to go into. But all of these fields have research assistants that work under PhDs. So if you decide to just get a bachelor's, people can get jobs in these fields working underneath PhDs. So in review, we talked about the biological roots of behavioral neuroscience. We looked at evolution, and we finished up with some careers in behavioral neuroscience. Thanks. Come on back.